In the heart of Tennessee, where rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see and the morning mist clung to ancient oak trees, lived a young woman whose world was about to change forever. Sarah Mae Thompson had always known that life wasn't fair, but she never imagined just how cruel fate could be until the day her father's will was read aloud in the dusty law office on Main Street. While her 3 older brothers inherited the sprawling 1,000-acre ranch, the prize-winning cattle, and the modern equipment that kept the Thompson family legacy alive, Sarah Mae received nothing but a broken-down wagon and an old mule named Chester. The lawyer's words echoed in her mind as she stood there in her simple cotton dress, watching her brothers exchange satisfied glances. 23 years old and suddenly homeless, she had 48 hours to leave the only home she'd ever known. The wagon creaked ominously as Sarah Mae loaded her few possessions into its weathered bed. Chester, a stubborn mule with graying fur and knowing eyes, seemed to sense her despair as she hitched him to the decrepit vehicle. Her brothers, Jake, Tommy, and Bill, stood on the porch of the grand farmhouse, arms crossed, waiting for her departure. There was no sympathy in their faces, only the cold calculation of men who had finally rid themselves of what they considered dead weight. Sarah Mae's mother had died when she was 12, and her father, though loving, had always believed that women belonged in the kitchen, not in the fields or the family business. Now, with both parents gone, she was discovering just how little that love had translated into practical security. As the wagon wheels began their slow journey down the dusty drive, Sarah Mae couldn't help but look back at the sprawling white house where she'd spent her entire life. The wraparound porch where she'd shelled peas with her mother, the old rope swing hanging from the massive maple tree, the barn where she'd learned to milk cows before dawn each morning. All of it was disappearing behind her, becoming nothing more than memories. Chester plodded along steadily, his hooves creating a rhythmic cadence on the packed earth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Tennessee landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. The first night on the road was harder than Sarah Mae had anticipated. She pulled the wagon off the main road and made camp beside a small creek, the sound of running water providing some comfort in the overwhelming silence. Chester grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to look at her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets she couldn't begin to understand. As she sat by a small fire, eating cold beans from a can and wondering what tomorrow would bring, she noticed something odd about the mule's behavior. Every few minutes, Chester would walk to the back of the wagon and paw at something underneath it, making a soft, whinnying sound that seemed almost like he was trying to communicate something important. Curious and with nothing else to occupy her time, Sarah Mae took a lantern and crawled under the wagon to investigate what had captured Chester's attention. The wooden planks of the wagon bed were old and warped, but as she ran her hands along the underside, she discovered something that made her heart skip a beat. Hidden beneath layers of dirt and grime was a small metal plate, no bigger than her palm, with strange markings etched into its surface. The symbols looked like a combination of numbers and letters, but they were arranged in a pattern that didn't make immediate sense. She scraped away more dirt and found a second plate, then a third, each one bearing similar mysterious inscriptions that seemed to glow faintly in the lantern light. The next morning brought new questions and a growing sense that Chester was far more than just an ordinary mule. As they continued their journey toward the nearest town, Millerville, where Sarah Mae hoped to find work and lodging, the animal began displaying behaviors she'd never noticed before. When they came to crossroads, Chester would pause and seem to consider each direction carefully before choosing a path, almost as if he knew where they were supposed to go. When other travelers approached on the road, the mule would position himself protectively beside the wagon, his ears alert and his stance suggesting he was evaluating potential threats. Most unsettling of all, Chester seemed to understand every word Sarah Mae spoke to him, responding with nods, head shakes, and complex expressions that bordered on human comprehension. By the third day, Sarah Mae realized that their destination wasn't going to be Millerville after all. Despite her efforts to guide Chester toward the town, the stubborn mule consistently chose routes that led them deeper into the countryside, toward areas she'd never explored even during her years living in Tennessee. The landscape grew more rugged and wild, with dense forests of pine and hickory giving way to rocky outcroppings and hidden valleys that seemed untouched by human civilization. When she tried to force Chester back toward the main road, he would plant his feet and refuse to budge, no matter how much she pleaded or pushed. It was as if the animal had a specific destination in mind, and nothing was going to deter him from reaching it. On the fourth night, as they made camp in a clearing surrounded by towering cedars, Sarah May discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. While searching through her meager supplies for something to eat, she accidentally knocked over a loose board in the wagon's side panel, revealing a hidden compartment she'd never noticed before. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against time and weather, was a leather journal bound with a faded red ribbon. The cover bore her father's initials, and as she opened it with trembling hands, she realized she was looking at pages of her father's handwriting from decades ago, long before she was born. The revelation filled Sarah May with a mixture of excitement and terror. If the treasure was real, she would never have to worry about money again. She could buy her own land, build her own house, and live the independent life she'd always dreamed of. But the journal also contained warnings about the dangers that awaited anyone who sought the Confederate gold. Other treasure hunters had tried and failed to find it over the years, and some had never returned from their expeditions. The Tennessee wilderness was unforgiving, filled with treacherous terrain, dangerous wildlife, and weather that could turn deadly without warning. More troubling were her father's notes about other people who knew pieces of the Thompson family secret. Over the years, various individuals had approached her father with claims about the treasure, some offering partnerships and others making barely veiled threats. The journal mentioned names she didn't recognize and described encounters with men who seemed to know more about Ezekiel's discovery than they should have. Her father had been careful to reveal nothing, but Sarah May wondered if her brothers knew about the treasure and had deliberately ensured she inherited the wagon and Chester to keep the secret safe. Or perhaps they knew and had given her the means to find it because they were too afraid to attempt the journey themselves. As the days passed and Chester continued to lead them through increasingly remote areas of Tennessee, Sarah May began to notice signs that they were being followed. Twice she spotted smoke from distant campfires that seemed to mirror their own movements, always staying just far enough away to avoid detection but close enough to suggest surveillance. Chester became increasingly agitated during these encounters, his ears constantly swiveling and his body tense with an alertness that spoke of danger. The mule's behavior convinced Sarah May that whoever was following them wasn't simply curious about two travelers on a remote trail. They had a specific interest in her and Chester's destination. The breakthrough came on the seventh day, when Chester led them to a creek that perfectly matched a description in her father's journal. The water flowed over a distinctive rock formation that resembled the profile of a sleeping giant, and nearby stood a dead oak tree with branches that formed what looked like pointing fingers. Sarah May consulted the metal plates and realized that the symbols finally began to make sense when viewed in conjunction with these natural landmarks. Each plate corresponded to a different stage of the journey, and the markings indicated directions, distances, and specific features to look for along the way. Following Chester's lead and the coded directions from the plates, Sarah May guided the wagon off the established trail and into terrain that seemed untouched by human presence. Ancient trees formed a canopy so thick that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight, and the air was filled with the sounds of creatures she couldn't identify. Chester moved with increasing confidence, his pace quickening as if he sensed they were approaching their destination. The wagon bounced and creaked over roots and rocks, but somehow the old vehicle held together, as if it too understood the importance of completing this journey. On the eighth day, they reached a valley that took Sarah May's breath away. Hidden between towering cliffs and accessible only through a narrow passage that would have been easy to miss, the valley was a perfect circle of green meadow surrounded by walls of stone. A small stream wound through the center, feeding a series of natural pools that reflected the sky like mirrors. But most remarkable of all was what stood at the far end of the valley, the ruins of an old structure, barely visible through decades of overgrowth but unmistakably human-made. Chester stopped the wagon at the valley's entrance and refused to go farther, pawing the ground and making soft sounds that seemed to indicate they had reached their destination. Sarah May approached the ruins with her heart pounding, the metal plates clutched in her sweaty palms. The structure had once been a cabin or small building, but time and weather had reduced it to little more than a foundation and a few standing walls covered in vines and moss. As she searched through the overgrowth, she found what she was looking for, a stone bearing the same symbols that appeared on the metal plates. The treasure was here, somewhere in this hidden valley that time had forgotten, waiting for someone who possessed the knowledge and courage to claim it. But Sarah May's moment of triumph was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. The riders she'd suspected of following them had finally revealed themselves, and as they emerged from the narrow passage into the valley, she realized she was facing a situation far more dangerous than anything she'd imagined. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men with weapons and the kind of hardened faces that spoke of lives lived outside the law. The leader, a tall man with a graying beard and cold blue eyes, dismounted and approached her with the confidence of someone who held all the advantages. His name was Marcus Dalton, and he explained with chilling calmness that he'd been searching for the Confederate treasure for over 20 years. His grandfather had been one of the soldiers who'd helped hide the gold, and he'd passed down stories about the Thompson family's connection to the cache. When Sarah May's father had died, Dalton had been watching, waiting to see which of the children would inherit the key to the treasure. He'd followed her for days, allowing Chester to lead them both to the location he'd spent decades trying to find. Now that they'd arrived, he no longer needed either Sarah May or the mule that had brought them here. The standoff in the hidden valley stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Dalton's men spread out to prevent any chance of escape, while their leader methodically searched the ruins, following clues that only someone with extensive knowledge of the treasure could interpret. Sarah May watched in horror as they began tearing apart the ancient structure, destroying in minutes what had stood for generations. Chester remained perfectly still beside the wagon, but she could sense the tension in the animal's body, as if he were waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came when Dalton finally located what he'd been searching for, a section of the foundation that had been carefully constructed to hide a cavity beneath. As he and his men worked to pry up the stones, their attention became completely focused on their task, and Chester suddenly sprang into action. The mule charged toward the ruins with a speed that belied his age, scattering the treasure hunters and creating enough chaos for Sarah May to grab something she'd noticed earlier, a rusty old rifle that had been hidden among the debris of the collapsed cabin. The weapon might have been decades old, but it was still functional, and Sarah May had learned to shoot during her years on the farm. The sound of the rifle being cocked was enough to freeze everyone in place, giving her the advantage she needed to take control of the situation. But as she held the gun steady, pointing it at Dalton while his men hesitated with their own weapons half-drawn, she realized that simply driving off the treasure hunters wouldn't solve her problems. They knew where the gold was located now, and they would return with more men and better preparation. She needed a permanent solution, something that would ensure the treasure remained safe, and that she could claim it without fear of future interference. The solution came from an unexpected source, Chester himself. The mule approached the partially excavated hiding place and began pawing at the stones with deliberate precision, revealing something that none of them had anticipated. Instead of gold coins or bars, the cavity contained a collection of documents wrapped in waterproof material, along with a small metal box that jingled with the sound of coins, but was clearly too small to contain the legendary fortune they'd all been seeking. Sarah May realized with growing amazement that the hidden valley wasn't the final destination after all. It was another waypoint in a journey that was far from over. The documents revealed the truth about Ezekiel Thompson's discovery and the real location of the Confederate treasure. What he'd found in the Tennessee wilderness wasn't the gold itself, but rather detailed records of where it had been moved during the final days of the war. The Confederate soldiers had realized that their original hiding place was too accessible and had relocated the treasure to a series of caves in the Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of miles away. The valley and its ruins had served as a secure location for storing the maps and documentation that would be needed to find the real cache. But only someone who possessed both the coded plates and the knowledge to interpret them could access this crucial information. Marcus Dalton's face went through a series of expressions as Sarah May read portions of the documents aloud, first confusion, then anger, and finally a grudging respect for the cleverness of the long-dead Confederates who'd created such an elaborate system of misdirection. The treasure hunters had invested years of their lives in reaching this valley, only to discover that their journey was just beginning. But Sarah May held the documents now, along with the metal plates that would be needed to decode the next series of directions, and she had no intention of sharing that information with men who'd threatened her life. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Sarah May had ever experienced. Dalton and his men were desperate to continue the treasure hunt, but they needed her cooperation to interpret the documents and follow the new trail. Sarah May, meanwhile, realized that she couldn't complete the journey alone. The Appalachian caves mentioned in the documents were in some of the most dangerous and isolated terrain in the eastern United States, and she would need experienced guides and proper equipment to have any chance of success. A partnership between natural enemies seemed impossible, but the lure of the Confederate gold was strong enough to make even the most unlikely alliances seem worth considering. The compromise they reached was fragile and built on mutual distrust, but it offered each party something they desperately wanted. Sarah May would retain possession of the documents and metal plates, making her an indispensable part of any expedition to find the treasure. Dalton and his men would provide the expertise, equipment, and protection needed for the dangerous journey through the mountains. They would split the treasure equally once it was found, with Sarah May receiving half and the three men dividing the remainder among themselves. Chester, whose knowledge had brought them all to this point, would continue to guide them on the next phase of the journey, following genetic memories that stretched back through generations of specially bred mules. The journey to the Appalachian Mountains took 2 weeks and tested everyone's resolve in ways they hadn't anticipated. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they left the rolling hills of Tennessee behind and entered the rugged landscape of eastern Kentucky and western Virginia. Chester proved his worth again and again, finding passages through seemingly impassable terrain and somehow navigating routes that weren't marked on any map. The weather turned against them as well, with early autumn storms that brought freezing rain and winds that made travel dangerous and miserable. But the greatest challenges came from within the group itself. Trust was a luxury none of them could afford, and every decision became a negotiation fraught with suspicion and second-guessing. Dalton's men, whose names were revealed to be Sam and Tom, clearly resented having to treat Sarah May as an equal partner rather than simply taking the documents by force. Sarah May, meanwhile, was constantly aware that she was outnumbered and that her usefulness to the treasure hunters would end the moment they found the gold. Only Chester seemed immune to the tension, focused entirely on the journey ahead and the mysterious destination that drew him forward with increasing urgency. The breakthrough came when they reached a section of mountains that matched descriptions in the Confederate documents. A series of natural landmarks, a waterfall that split into 3 streams, a cliff face that bore the profile of what looked like a bearded man, and a grove of trees that grew in a perfect circle, confirmed that they were following the right path. Chester led them to a cave entrance hidden behind a curtain of vegetation, so well concealed that they might have walked past it a dozen times without noticing if not for the mule's guidance. The cave system was vast and complex, with passages that branched in multiple directions and chambers that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their lanterns. But Chester navigated the underground maze with the same confidence he'd shown above ground, following a route that had been encoded in his ancestral memory through generations of careful breeding and training. The air grew colder and more still as they descended deeper into the earth, and their voices echoed strangely off walls that seemed to absorb and distort sound in unsettling ways. After hours of underground travel that left them all exhausted and disoriented, they emerged into a vast chamber that took their breath away. The cavern was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into blackness and walls covered in formations that glittered like jewels in the light of their lanterns. But most incredible of all was what waited in the center of the chamber, a collection of wooden crates and metal containers that had been carefully arranged and protected from the elements for over half a century. The Confederate treasure was real, and it was more magnificent than any of them had dared to imagine. Gold coins bearing the faces of long-dead presidents, silver bars stamped with official markings, and precious stones that caught the light and threw it back in dazzling displays of color. There was enough wealth in that hidden chamber to make all of them rich beyond their wildest dreams, enough to buy land and houses and security that would last for generations. Sarah May stood in the midst of the treasure, hardly able to believe that the broken-down wagon and stubborn mule that had seemed like cruel jokes just weeks earlier had led her to a fortune that would change her life forever. But even in that moment of triumph, Sarah May couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The treasure was exactly where the Confederate documents had indicated it would be, and Chester had led them to it without hesitation. But the cave system itself felt different from what she'd expected. The passages were too well maintained, the air too fresh, and the chamber too clean for a location that had supposedly been untouched for decades. As she examined the treasure more closely, she began to notice details that didn't match the historical timeline. Mint dates on some of the coins that were too recent, and preservation techniques that seemed more modern than what would have been available to Confederate soldiers. The truth hit her like a physical blow when she found a newspaper hidden beneath one of the crates. The paper was only 3 years old, and its headlines referenced events that had occurred long after the Civil War had ended. The treasure chamber wasn't an untouched Confederate cache. It was an active storage facility being used by someone in the present day. Sarah May realized with growing horror that they had walked into a trap, and that whoever was using this cave as a hiding place would not appreciate unexpected visitors discovering their secret. The sound of approaching footsteps from multiple directions confirmed Sarah May's worst fears. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and trapped in an underground chamber with no escape route except the way they'd entered. But as armed figures emerged from the shadows, carrying lanterns that revealed faces she didn't recognize, Sarah May realized that the situation was even more complex than she'd imagined. These weren't random criminals or treasure hunters. They were wearing uniforms and moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military or law enforcement training. The leader of the new arrivals introduced himself as Agent Harrison from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he explained that the cave system had been under surveillance for months as part of an ongoing investigation into a money laundering operation. The Confederate treasure was actually stolen cash and valuables that had been hidden by a criminal organization, and Sarah May's group had stumbled into the middle of a federal sting operation. Chester's genetic memory hadn't led them to Civil War gold after all. It had brought them to a modern crime scene, and now they were all potential witnesses in a case that involved millions of dollars and some very dangerous people. The revelation turned everything Sarah May thought she knew about her journey upside down. The documents in her father's journal were genuine, and Chester's abilities were real, but the treasure they'd been following was a red herring that had led them into a situation far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The Confederate gold might still exist somewhere, but this cave contained something entirely different, evidence of crimes that were still being committed and criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their operation. Agent Harrison explained that they'd been tracking the money laundering ring for over a year, following a trail that led from major cities to this remote cave system in the Appalachian Mountains. The criminals had been using the caves to store cash and valuables between transactions, believing that the remote location and difficult access would keep their operation safe from discovery. Sarah May's arrival with Chester and the treasure hunters had been detected by hidden surveillance equipment, and federal agents had been watching them ever since they'd entered the cave system. But the situation was about to become even more complicated. The real criminals who'd been using the cave were scheduled to return that very night to retrieve a significant portion of the stored money for a major transaction. Agent Harrison and his team had planned to arrest them when they arrived, but Sarah May's presence created complications that threatened the entire operation. The criminals would be armed and dangerous, and if they discovered that their hiding place had been compromised, they might flee before the federal agents could apprehend them. The FBI agent offered Sarah May and her companions a choice that would determine their immediate future. They could cooperate with the federal investigation, helping to ensure that the criminals were captured when they arrived, and in return they would receive protection and immunity from any charges related to their unauthorized entry into the cave system. Or they could attempt to leave immediately, but they would be on their own if they encountered the returning criminals, and they would face potential federal charges for interfering with an ongoing investigation. Sarah May found herself making decisions she'd never imagined having to make, weighing risks and consequences that went far beyond the simple treasure hunt she'd thought she was undertaking. Chester stood beside her in the vast chamber, calm and alert as always, seeming to understand that their adventure had taken a turn that none of his ancestral memories had prepared him for. The mule that had led her away from her father's farm and into the Tennessee wilderness had brought her to a crossroads where the choices she made would echo through the rest of her life. The decision to cooperate with the FBI proved to be the right one, though the night that followed tested Sarah May's courage in ways she'd never experienced. Hidden with Agent Harrison's team in concealed positions throughout the cave system, she watched as the real criminals arrived to collect their stolen money. The arrest operation unfolded with swift precision, resulting in the capture of 6 individuals who'd been wanted in connection with crimes across multiple states. The money and valuables in the cave were indeed the proceeds from illegal activities, but their recovery would help bring justice to victims who'd suffered losses totaling millions of dollars. In the aftermath of the arrests, Sarah May found herself at the center of a story that made headlines across Tennessee and beyond. The young woman who'd inherited nothing but a broken wagon and an old mule had stumbled upon one of the largest money laundering operations in the region's history. Chester became something of a celebrity himself, with reporters and photographers eager to capture images of the remarkable animal whose genetic memory had led to such an unexpected discovery. The federal government offered Sarah May a substantial reward for her cooperation in the investigation, providing her with the financial security she'd been seeking when she first set out to find the Confederate treasure. But the most important revelation came when Agent Harrison shared information that had been uncovered during the investigation into Sarah May's background. Her father's journal had been more accurate than she'd realized. There really was a Confederate treasure hidden somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, and the documents she'd found in the hidden valley were genuine historical artifacts. The criminals had been using the cave system because they'd discovered references to the Civil War gold and believed that the remote location would be perfect for their own purposes. The real treasure was still out there, waiting to be found by someone who possessed the knowledge and determination to follow the trail to its conclusion. The story of Sarah May Thompson and Chester the Mule became a legend that spread throughout Tennessee and beyond, inspiring others to pursue their own dreams of discovery and adventure. But for Sarah May herself, the most important treasure she'd found wasn't gold or money. It was the knowledge that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The broken wagon had carried her away from a life of limitations and toward a future filled with possibilities she was only beginning to understand. Chester lived out his remaining years on the farm Sarah May purchased with her reward money, grazing in pastures where his descendants would continue the remarkable tradition of genetic memory that had made their adventure possible. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Tennessee sky was painted with the colors of sunset, Sarah May would sit on her porch and wonder what other secrets were waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to follow an old mule into the unknown wilderness of America's hidden history.